There are seats in front. In fact, the whole front row is empty.
Uh-huh.
So for me, this course is very much part of that is linked to. So it's very much. So the project's very much informed, as
Uh-huh.
in my short what our discussions here.
Uh-huh.
And actually, it was Gordon's idea that the way you get economists engaged in these issues is by actually, you know, providing some systematic data on what is happening at the ground level. Because what economists do are do things like look at the effect of tax incentives or look at the effect of subsidies, things that they can measure.
Uh-huh.
But many of the things that we talk about here, which are sort of these collaborative initiatives, which are both harder to measure, and nobody really has tried to systematically provide evidence on that.
Uh-huh.
So the idea that is that we say that these are in fact what's really working are these collaborative, iterative systems of industrial policy where you're bringing in a whole bunch of people working with small, medium-sized enterprises to increase their capacities. you're combining workforce training with business incentives, but in a much more customized way, working with, with firms, and that you're doing this sort of in an iterative fashion over time. That this has potentially, can change. Both bring this much more to the fore in the way that economists think about local development policies, and also, sort of make it. But the idea is that this is the leading edge towards thinking about alternative forms of the market.
I somehow feel that our agenda has been creeping into the general discourse. I mean, the other day I heard the statement of Hillary Clinton, of all people, on television. And she was attacking the Democratic Party for its lack of institutional and structural alternatives and so forth. And I wonder,
Did she actually say that?
Where does that come from? These are mysterious transformations.
Just to remind you again, we're going to start in about 2 minutes, just 10 minutes after the half hour. And those of you who are sitting, if you're sitting on the floor somewhere, there are actually seats on the front row here, so you're welcome to come. And we don't mind if you get up and leave in the middle of the talk, so don't be embarrassed. 2 more minutes. Did you have difficulty finding this room? So did we. So I do have slides, but I'm not going to use them unless I need to point to something. There's a chart that I need to refer to, that I might go and use it. But otherwise, we'll try to do it in this.
So shall we begin? Shall we begin? So let's begin. This is Political Economy and Its Future. I'm Roberto Unger. This is Danny Roderick. And I am going to start by describing 3 themes of the course: 2 substantive themes and a methodological theme. So the first theme of the course is, what are the alternative forms of the market economy? And the mere enunciation of this theme already contradicts a view that is very widespread in practical economics and policy discussion, namely the view that the market economy has a single natural and necessary form. One could specify a single natural and necessary legal and institutional form. Now, it is true that in the evolution of legal thought, from the middle of the 19th century to the end of the 20th, one of the most important developments was the deconstruction of this idea, and the discovery that the market economy has no single natural and necessary form. The jurists discovered that as you translate the abstract idea of the market down to greater levels of concreteness, at each step down there are choices to be made. And these choices cannot be resolved by referring back to the abstract idea of the market. They turn on conflicts of interest and of vision. But this discovery of the jurists never seems to have completely penetrated the inner core of practical economics. Now, before I go any further, let me suggest that even if you take the idea of a market economy at its most abstract level, without specifying any institutional detail or exploring it in any particular tangible context, there is already an ambiguity. What does a market order mean? On the one hand, it means a decentralized economy in which many economic agents can bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. But that's not the whole meaning of the abstract idea of the market. There is at least one other idea. And the other idea has to do with the degree of control, you might say the absoluteness of the control, that each of those agents has over the resources at his command. On this view, a market economy would be an economy that is not simply decentralized, but in which those decentralized agents have absolute control over those resources. And the expression of this idea of absolute control is the classical conception of property, of private property. Now, it may seem that these two dimensions of the abstract idea of the market, the dimension of absolute decentralization and the dimension of absolute control, go naturally and necessarily together. But it seems clear that they don't. And that not only do they not go naturally and necessarily together, but they may contradict each other. It may be that one way to increase the absolute amount of economic decentralization is to qualify the absoluteness of the control so that we can have forms of property that are temporary or conditional in different ways. And then we could have more decentralization at the cost of having less absolute control. So we see there through that little thought experiment that even at its greatest level of abstraction, the idea of a market order is already ambiguous. And this ambiguity invites us to explore the possibility that it might have the market order, alternative institutional forms. Now, in this course, we are going to explore this idea in three main contexts. The first context is the context of the relation between the advanced forms of production in an economy and the backward forms. If you like, the vanguards and the rear guards. And I'm not going to say anything more for the moment about that because I'm going to come back to that in the description of the second theme of the course. The second context in which we are going to explore this plurality of the possible forms of the market is the context of the relation between finance and the real economy, or finance and production. So a conventional idea is that a perfectly competitive capital market, by definition, allocates resources to their most efficient uses, unless there is some competitive flaw, some imperfection in competition. And if there is an imperfection in competition, then it would have to be addressed by regulation addressed to that localized competitive flaw. So on this view, a capital market will be perfectly efficient. It will allocate resources to their most efficient uses unless it suffers from some failure of competition, including asymmetrical information, or some failure in the localized regulatory response to the localized competitive imperfection. But this view we are going to contrast with another view, another set of views, according to which different ways of organizing a market economy can either tighten or loosen the relation between finance and the real economy, or between finance and production. They can enlist finance in the service of the productive agenda of society more or less effectively. And so it would not be true that there's only one way in principle of organizing the relation between finance and the real economy. There would be many ways. And this view would gain practical importance if we came to believe that the best way to make finance less dangerous would be to make it more useful. Now, the third context in which we propose to explore this idea of the alternative forms of the market economy is the relation between labor and capital. The dominant form of free labor, of free work, is wage labor, economically dependent wage labor. Labor is bought and sold, labor time. And Karl Marx believed that that was one of the most characteristic features of what he called capitalism. But this view actually only became predominant in the late 19th century. Up to the late 19th century, the general view, which was shared by liberals as well as by socialists, is that economically dependent wage labor was a transitory, defective, and inferior form of free work, retaining some of the characteristics of slavery and serfdom. The higher forms of free work would be self-employment and cooperation. But the liberals and socialists of the 19th century never managed to reconcile their idea of the superiority of these higher forms, self-employment and cooperation, with the imperative of the aggregation of resources at scale. Because it seems that that reconciliation would require innovation in the property regime, that is, in the terms of access to the productive resources of society, what Karl Marx called the means of production. So that's a fundamental ambiguity in the labor market. And today, the practical significance of that ambiguity is foreshadowed by a dramatic circumstance. In all the major economies of the world, an increasing part of the labor force is consigned to unstable, temporary, or otherwise insecure employment, what you could call precarious employment. And the question is how this reality of precarious employment, which can weigh very heavily on any dynamic of cumulative innovation of the rise of productivity, can and should be addressed. So this is the first large theme that we are going to explore in the course. We're going to relate it to a series of practical debates in political economy, but it is a fundamental theme. The market economy, on this view, has no single natural and necessary form. It can take different forms with different consequences. Different consequences not simply for the distribution of economic advantage and disadvantage, but also for the organization of production and exchange. So the fundamental insight that is in question in this debate is the insight into the institutional indeterminacy of the market order. And you can see that this is a very potent theme when you consider that for 200 years, the main model of ideological conflict has been the market versus the state. More market, less state. More state, less market. Or synthesis of market and state, which is social democracy or social liberalism as developed in the 20th century. But if we pursue this idea of the indeterminacy of the conception of the market, we come to another question. The other question is not more market or less market, but which market? What are the alternative forms that the market can take? And what is then the significance of those forms for the totality of economic, social, and cultural life? Now let me stop here and ask whether Danny would like to comment.
So I come at these questions from a somewhat different vantage point since I'm an economist, but I do share this view that Roberto just articulated about the need to consider the market economy as something that is not just one and a fixed, but to consider it as something that's highly malleable. And I think that is indeed one of the key themes of this course. And Roberto didn't say it, but I think it's worth emphasizing that this course is not about just absorbing a given sort of readings and a given set of ideas. What we want you to take out of this course is very much a kind of an institutional imagination. To think about different ways of organizing the market and the institutions that underpin it in the number of different contexts that Roberto mentioned, whether it's in the area of finance, whether it's in the area of the relation of labor to capital, or whether it is in the nature of technological change and the degree to which it dissipates throughout society. And in variety of policy areas such as globalization, or discussion of globalization, or discussion on climate change. So that key theme, the malleability of a market economy is fundamental. And I hope that we will make this more concrete as we go on in each one of these different institutional areas. The way that I would put this theme as an economist is to say that a market, as defined as Roberto did, which is a kind of a system of decentralized exchange with private property, that is not a system that is self-standing, that operates on its own, or that it generates on its own. It is necessarily embedded in a variety of institutions which ensure that those markets can exist. The institutions that design and enhance and protect property rights are probably the most critical of those. But the moment you say that, how are we going to protect property rights and what are the limits of property rights, you're immediately into a set of complicated questions about what the limits of property rights are, whether it's one thing, whether it's many things, whether it's limited over time across different streams of income, across different types of property. So these questions immediately present themselves the moment that you think that the minimal condition for the existence of markets is this private property rights. But property rights are a set of legal and administrative arrangements which have to be designed. And we need to think about what's right, about the limits of property. But it's not just about property rights. In order for markets to exist, you need to ensure that the conditions for competition are there. So immediately you're into areas like regulating markets through antitrust competition policy, through the internalization of externalities, through preventing of market abuse, through the ensuring that information is not abused due to asymmetric information, whole variety of market failures that are embedded to the operation of markets and therefore need to be counteracted by a set of regulatory institutions. So in order for markets to perform as they are advertised to perform, you need a whole set of regulatory institutions to ensure, well, the whole questions about how do we design those regulations, once again, makes concrete the idea that we need to think creatively about how to design those institutions. Third, markets are not self-stabilizing. You need a set of macroeconomic arrangements, monetary arrangements, fiscal arrangements, prudential regulation of finance to ensure that markets can be stabilized over time, as sort of long history of depressions and recessions and unemployment and high inflation have shown. So markets need to be stabilized through institutions that are outside markets. And then ultimately, of course, markets need to be legitimized because they need to, we need to ensure that what markets do are consistent with the overall norms and goals of society. So without those institutions, you cannot have markets really prosper or survive or function. And each of those are really questions about design, about how we're going to be designing that. We can also see this process about how ideas about how we create different types of market economy, how those ideas have evolved over time. So one way to tell the story that I'm telling and Roberto told about the malleability of market institutions is to go back in history and see, in fact, how ideas about how markets ought to be organized have changed over time. Therefore, pointing to the possibility that we might yet have different forms in the future, that what we have just experienced in the last 40 years is, in fact, not necessarily the one and only form. So, of course, you can go back to classical liberalism, which had a very different conception of the role of regulation in markets, which have a sort of very limited conception. Basically, all you had to have is a tolerable administration of justice and a minimal system of property rights and a national defense, and that was all that was needed for markets to operate. That was superseded by a system of, you can call it the welfare state, the New Deal, eventually social democracy, which provided for a much more expansive set of safeguards for society and for workers and various different stakeholders that have a very different conception of what the market society ought to look like. There are different conceptions of market economy that go back to the, sort of the thought, the period of thinking about economic arrangements that predates classical liberalism, the system of mercantilism, for example, which had a very different conception of the role of political economy. And the idea of mercantilism, that society ought to be organized in corporatist form, and the idea of economy was to enrich the sovereign. Many of these ideas actually have survived to this day in some of the practices that we see in forms of East Asian capitalism, for example, in the way that industrial policies and the relationship between the state and business have been organized in different societies. A very different strand of thinking about market societies, of course, the market socialism. The idea that you could actually have a socialist society, but that was organized under the auspices of sort of, in a way where property was in fact held in common. It was socialized. There were long debates in the 1920s, debates about economic doctrine, whether in fact the public ownership of the means of production was compatible with a market society, with a market economy. And the theoretical answer to that was given in the 1920s was the answer was yes. There was nothing incompatible with a market society. That was where property was in fact also widely, broadly held. That was market socialism, and there are socialists who still believe that that's in fact where we ought to go. We move more recently, of course, we have neoliberalism as a form of a sort of different conception of the market economy in some ways that moved from the welfare state back to some earlier conceptions towards more akin to classical liberalism. The idea that the kinds of Keynesian macroeconomic policies had gone too far, the welfare state and redistributive policies had gone too far, that there was this frontier of hyper-globalization that could be reached and provide much greater benefits to the world, and pushed on a number of different dimensions. That is our most recent experience of an economic system, let's say from the 1990s onward, the system of neoliberalism. The version of it that existed in the developing world was often known as the Washington Consensus, a set of ideas about how to organize the economy. We are now in the midst of a transition, okay? Nobody believes in neoliberalism anymore. You can't even find who those neoliberalists were. But it's not at all clear what's going to take its place. But even if you look at the policy discussions that are going on today in Washington or in Brussels, in the European Union, there is in fact a significantly different flavor on a very wide range of areas. And I think it's important to sort of very quickly link to those contemporary discussions about economic policy, because what we're trying to do is to think coherently and systematically about what that might add up to as ideas towards an economy that is more inclusive and more progressive, more productive at the same time. So in the area of monetary policy, central banks are now behaving very differently than they did after, as recently as 10 years ago. The idea of inflation hawks, that the central banks would operate as inflation hawks, that they would raise interest rates at the slightest indication that inflation might rise. That seems to have completely disappeared. So people are now, even criticizing central banks, particularly the Fed, but also to some extent the European Central Bank, for being too soft on inflation. Well, it's possible to say that what they're doing now is in fact emphasizing much more employment capacity rather than inflation. The discussion about fiscal policy has changed significantly, with much more emphasis on fiscal policy that is contributing to aggregate demand and contributing to full employment. So if you simply compare the response of fiscal policy to the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, to the response of fiscal policy to the COVID pandemic, it's really remarkable how much more aggressive, much more ambitious fiscal policy has been in the current pandemic compared to the previous economic crisis during the great financial crisis, where the response was rather timid and of very limited scope. So very different ideas about what the role of fiscal policy ought to be. In the area of corporate taxation, right, we've now moved to an area where way of thinking about corporate taxation, where it's no longer okay for different governments to compete to lower taxes so they can attract investment. So race to the bottom in corporate taxation was in fact, in the eyes of many economists, a good thing, because lowering taxes on corporations is a good thing. That idea has completely changed. Now we even have the rudiments of an international agreement to put a floor on corporate taxation. Industrial policy. We'll talk a lot about different types of industrial policy in this course. In the United States, you couldn't even mention industrial policy in polite company until very recently. Now it's being trumpeted on the website of the White House. So it's in a major way. And it's very much the same in Europe as well. In labor markets, one of our key themes is the relationship of labor to capital. The discussion has moved from more competition for labor and deinstitutionalization of deregulation of labor markets as being a good thing, to now explicitly talking about the need to enhance the bargaining power of labor, the need to enhance labor unions, particularly in the United States. The attitude to big tech and platform companies is also undergoing significant change. Right? there used to be, sort of the major innovators in society and source of huge consumer benefits. But now increasingly they're coming under scrutiny and increased regulation for essentially too much power, too much concentration. Finally, in the area of trade policy and globalization. So we've moved from a discussion in terms of how do we reap or how do we maximize the gains from trade and the efficiencies of the International Division of Labor to thinking about in terms of resilience, that we should perhaps not rely too much on global supply chains. We should enhance supply chains that are closer to home, that are more reliable, to have more resilient production chains. And for all practical purposes, the World Trade Organization has been dead. Biden, interestingly, has not lowered any of the tariffs that Trump had placed on China. Might talk a very different talk, but in terms of actual practice, trade policy looks very different. So these are all domains that suggest that there's something going on here. There's a very different set of ideas. So in that sense, I think our conversation here is, and we've been having this course for how long now?
On and off for a long time.
For a very long time, but it's different, believe me, against the, so these are the kinds of issues that we're going to be talking about in this course, about how we change the relationship of capital to labor, how we change about sort of the direction of technological change, how we address problems of globalization, how we address industrial policy in a practical way, how do we create good jobs. Those are in many ways much closer to the current policy debates and policy discussions than they have ever been. So that's, we won't always agree with Roberto, but on this, at least sort of this big theme, we agree on its importance and its relevance. Back to you, but maybe before we go back, we should ask, are there any questions about the logistics of this course? Let me introduce Han-Sung Lee, who is the teaching fellow for the undergraduates. Can you maybe stand up so people can see at least half of your face? So this is for the undergraduates. There will be review sessions that will start maybe, I guess, in 3 weeks, but you will hear more from Han-Sung on that. We'll go on with our discussion. So the usual way we will hold these classes will be, sort of as a dialogue and discussion and debate, and then we will open it up also to your contributions, and we will continue with this discussion. But before we do so, I want to make sure to ask if there are any questions about the logistics or administrative details before we go on deeper into the substance. Good. Back to you.
Right. So the second large substantive theme of the course is the theme of the alternative futures of the knowledge economy. The name by which we describe what is now the most advanced practice of production in the major economies of the world. Now, first a comment about the concept of the most advanced practice of production. The most advanced practice of production is not necessarily, when it first emerges, the most efficient practice, the practice which produces the most output with the greatest economy of inputs. It is the practice that has the greatest potential to transform the whole economy and to remain at the frontier of productive efficiency, to reach it and to stay there and to exercise an exemplary influence on the whole economy. Adam Smith and Karl Marx, the two greatest economists in the history of economics, both believed that the best way to study the economy was to study its most advanced practice of production. At the time of Adam Smith and of Karl Marx, this was mechanized manufacturing, which later resulted in what we call industrial mass production. The large-scale production of standardized goods and services with relatively rigid machines and production processes on the basis of semi-skilled labor in highly specialized and hierarchical relations of production. The reason why Smith and Marx believed that this was the best way to study the workings of the economy is that they thought that the most advanced practice of production is the production that would most fully reveal our powers, our human powers of creation and invention, and it's closer to who we are, and that was the reason to study it. Now, industrial mass production is no longer the most advanced practice of production. It has been succeeded by a form of production characterized not just by the accumulation of capital, technology, and science, but by permanent innovation or experimentalism. And it is not to be confused with simply high-tech manufacture. That's only its most salient instance. The platform oligopolies, for example, in the United States. The knowledge economy exists now in every sector of the economy. It is multi-sectoral. It exists in intellectually dense services and even in precision or scientific agriculture, as well as in high-tech manufacture. And indeed, in the age of the knowledge economy, the clarity of the distinction among sectors of production is waning, because in a sense, high-tech manufacture consists in crystallized and combined intellectual services. Nevertheless, despite its multi-sectoral character, its omnipresence in the economy, in all the sectors of the economy in which it is present, the knowledge economy exists only as a fringe, as an insular vanguard that excludes the vast majority of workers and of firms. And this insular character of the new vanguardism has a fateful significance for the evolution of society and of the economy. First of all, it has a significance for economic growth and for the rise of productivity. You know, there is now in the United States a discourse that goes under the label secular stagnation, which attempts to naturalize economic slowdown, the slowdown of growth and of the rise in productivity. It attributes economic slowdown, for example, to the supposedly diminished potential of the technological innovations of today when compared to the technological innovations of 100 years ago. But one could question this doctrine of secular stagnation. What in principle could be more revolutionary than artificial intelligence? A characteristic example of the technologies on which the knowledge economy relies. There seems to be a much simpler and more straightforward explanation of slowdown. How could there not be slowdown, one could say, if the most advanced practice is denied to the vast majority of workers and of businesses, and increasingly concentrated in an island from which everyone else is banished. So that's the first significance. It's significance for economic growth. And then it has a massive significance for economic inequality. Economic inequality seems to be anchored in these structural divisions between the advanced and backward parts of production. There's a vanguard of highly productive, highly advanced, capital-intensive, technology-intensive, experimental firms, and then there's a long tail of backward firms, especially the small and medium-sized enterprises that are responsible for the majority of the output and of the jobs in a contemporary economy. So it's as if, to exaggerate slightly, one could say there's this little elite that is in the vanguard, and everyone else in these economies is condemned to some form of make work. So then, according to the doctrines of social liberalism and social democracy, what we have to do is to redistribute retrospectively through progressive taxation and redistributive social spending. We have to redistribute part of the wealth that this vanguard creates to the rest, to all those people who were locked out of the vanguard. But this operation of retrospective and compensatory redistribution encounters very severe limits, because it establishes right at the outset a conflict, a contradiction, a tension between the logic of the established economic arrangements and incentives and the logic of the equitable attenuation of inequality. And this logic and this tension is captured in the familiar rhetoric, which we all know, of the tension between equity and efficiency. It seems that the only adequate way of addressing these inequalities would be to reach them in their structural basis. If there's a growing abyss, a division between the vanguard and everyone else, it's that division that has to be fixed if we are to recreate a basis, a more inclusive basis for economic growth, and address the extremes of inequality. So this is the second large theme of the course. And this theme gains its edge, it catches fire, because it relates to a new dilemma about economic growth and development that has arisen in the world, and which we are only beginning to understand. So in the second half of the 20th century, the message of what we could now call classical development economics is that there is a shortcut to rapid economic growth. The shortcut is to take workers and resources from the less productive sector of the economy, or the less productive sectors, and to put it in the most productive sector. And in practice, that meant to take them from agriculture and to put them in industry. Ultimately, this shortcut would encounter limits in the so-called fundamentals, which were institutions, like the institution of private property, and education. But in fact, these fundamentals impose very little restraint on the efficacy of the shortcut. Now, what has happened in the world? What has happened is that for reasons that we will explore in this course, the shortcut has stopped working. And one country in the world after another is deindustrializing. That vanguard, the old vanguard of mass production, we call it sometimes Fordist mass production, evoking Henry Ford's assembly line, the automobile industry. That shortcut is no longer the vanguard. It is the vestige of a previous vanguard, or it is a sidekick to the new vanguard, a satellite. The people who control the new vanguard have found a way to bifurcate production, to divide it in half. And the parts of production that they have learned how to routinize, they can then subcontract to workers and firms in remote parts of the world. And they can keep for themselves the intangible, creative, and lucrative core. So rather than spreading throughout the whole economy and becoming economy-wide, this new vanguard has retreated further and further. And the chasm between the vanguard and everything else has deepened. So here then is the dilemma. The old shortcut has stopped working. But what would the alternative to it be? The alternative would be a socially inclusive form of the new vanguard of the knowledge economy. But that alternative doesn't exist. It doesn't exist even in the richest and most educated parts of the world, like the European social democracies or the United States. How could it exist in the rest of the world? So in a way, this is analogous to the problem of the Owney market, right? The classical form of the market is not adequate. But what's the alternative form? So there's a connection between this theme and the first theme of the course. And the connection is that it seems that the initiatives that would be capable of deepening and disseminating the market economy would require experimentation in the institutional form of the market order. So it would require us to give content to that idea that the market order can have alternative forms. And this then is the second large theme, the theme of how we are to advance in the world the cause of an inclusive and disseminated market economy. Its dissemination and its deepening are two sides of the same process. A practice of production deepens and reveals its potential as it spreads through many parts of the economy. And what we have now is a market economy that is, on the one hand, insular, and on the other hand, truncated, that fails to reveal its full potential. The potential to bring together the experience of production and the experience of creation or experimental invention. The change in the moral culture of production, because in this vanguard, all the participants in the process of production must be capable of exercising a higher level of discretion, of discretionary initiative, and of having a higher level of reciprocal trust toward one another. It's like the difference between a traditional infantry battalion and a guerrilla or special forces operation. It's by its dissemination that the knowledge economy would reveal its potential. And it's now the opposite of disseminated. It's quarantined in these cysts. It's cabined. And this is then the second great theme in the course.
Yes, so the second theme is the answer to the question of why do we need new institutional arrangements in the first place.
Yes.
Right? So our take on the answer to that question is what Roberto just laid out, that there is a global phenomenon right now, which I would characterize in my own word as a kind of a structural productive dualism that exists both in developing countries and in the advanced economies. Now, the notion of a productive dualism is not a new notion in the context of developing countries, because developing countries always have been characterized with sort of these relatively narrow islands of high productivity production in a sea of poverty and relatively precarious and low productivity employment. But what is striking about the current global landscape is the extent to which advanced countries, in some sense, are beginning to approximate the same structural features. Of course, not with that same level of poverty or deprivation as in the developing world, but the same phenomenon that the benefits of what Roberto calls the technological vanguard, or the most advanced forms of production, or the most productive parts of the economy, to use straightforward economics language, they tend to be limited to a rather narrow range of society. The metropolitan centers, the skilled professionals, large corporations, and a set of firms which are on this productive vanguard. While large parts of the labor force is stuck in not necessarily unemployment, but in kinds of jobs that are relatively precarious, low productivity, and without a kind of a career ladder for progression into more productive spheres of employment. Geographically, the same divide exhibits itself between these successful metropolitan centers and the parts of the country that are relatively left out of these productive sources of employment. So regional divides that are opening up. In the United States, for example, until a couple of decades ago, until the 1990s, there was a process of economic convergence with parts of the country that were relatively lower incomes, lower productivity, catching up with the coastal areas or the Northeast. That process of convergence stopped after the 1990s. So this process of productive dualism and which is becoming entrenched has somewhat different causes, but related causes in the developing world and in the advanced world. In the developing world, a lot of what's happening is precisely the process that industrialization is not working as it used to. Industrialization is the traditional model, not just of economic growth, but it's also the traditional model for creating a middle class. What happens historically and also in perhaps a dozen or so of developing countries, most notably in China, is that industrialization traditionally provides an opportunity for people from the countryside that are working in very low productivity subsistence agriculture to come to urban areas, get factory work. That is not certainly early on very necessarily very good jobs, but provide the opportunity for a kind of a productive trajectory that is definitely positive. And the other thing that industrialization traditionally did, of course, was enable the working class by getting together to organize, to find voice, and therefore work to generate sort of mechanisms of collective bargaining, collective voice, political voice, which made sure that the productive gains from industrialization ultimately also became improvements in living standards for ordinary workers, so that workers could get also, so the rise of social movements, labor movement, labor-based political parties was both a mechanism through which the possibilities of a broader middle class were created, the basis of social insurance was established, but also that in fact, political democracy became entrenched through these parties of representing the labor or sort of the traditional social democracies with parties of the left based on these labor movements. So this, both the economic transformation, the growth process, the creation of middle class, and the establishment of multi-party democracy were the consequences of this process of industrialization, which of course the model of which was Britain, later Western Europe, but as recently as in the post-war period, we've seen it take place in countries like South Korea and Taiwan that followed a model of development, although much more compressed in time. Now, industrialization is no longer working in the developing world because manufacturing no longer has the capacity to absorb large amounts of labor from the countryside as it did before. We'll talk about this later. We'll talk about this in our next class. But basically, because of many of these technological transformations and the technological trends and the forces of globalization, manufacturing is increasingly become skill intensive and capital intensive all around the world, which means that its ability to absorb a lot of labor from the countryside has become much more limited, so that even in the countries that have successfully industrialized more recently, the share of the labor force that's in manufacturing, formal factory manufacturing, working at high productivity, is very, very tiny compared to earlier manufacturers such as the East Asian industrializers or the European industrializers before in history. So manufacturing is no longer that escalator for overall economic growth, for overall inclusion, for the creation of the middle class. In the advanced world, which had already been beginning to deindustrialize after the 1970s, of course, forces of global competition and the presence of a few successful industrializers, export-oriented industrializers like East Asian tigers, Japan before them, and then eventually China, that process of economic globalization accelerated the industrialization in the advanced countries. So this is one part of the sort of the regional declines in some of the major manufacturing centers in the advanced world. And the disappearance of relatively good jobs in manufacturing is the consequence of this process of globalization. But also, of course, the process of technological change, which was heavily biased against labor, heavily biased towards skills, which rewarded skills, rewarded capital, rewarded large corporations, but was not working to create enough jobs in manufacturing. So that historically, now there was a change in the developed world where before, when people lost their jobs, for example, people went out of agriculture as agriculture became mechanized and much more productive, they could go to manufacturing, they could go to urban areas where in fact productivity and potentially wages were much higher. But if you were displaced from manufacturing after the 1970s, after the 1980s, certainly after the 1990s, you were much less likely to find jobs in higher wage service occupations. Instead, you were laid off into lower wage services, much more precarious employment. And that's, that's sort of the part of the process that led to and reinforced productive dualism in the advanced countries. In principle, as Roberto said, the innovation process that was happening in the other parts of the economy could have been disseminated throughout the rest of the economy. But for a variety of reasons that we'll discuss, this has not happened. So before I get to what the remedies might be and the kinds of things that we will talk about at much greater detail in this course, sort of what are the consequences of this productive, the deepening productive dualism in the advanced and the developing countries? Roberto mentioned two of them. One, in fact, most directly, of course, is on inequality, right? This process of labor market polarization and spatial or regional divides is, even where it does not show up as a rise in inequality, as in some cases in Western Europe, it shows up as disappearing opportunities for good job, more secure employment. And there's a certain element of economic insecurity and precarity that exists even in those countries where broad indicators of economic inequality do not show an increase. But of course, in the United States, of course, there has been a vast increase in inequality since the 1970s, especially in the share of the top 1% or the top 0.1% in incomes. So that's the most direct one, of course, is in terms of inequality and exclusion from economic opportunity. But as Roberto mentioned, it's not simply about inclusion and equity. It's also about overall economic progress, economic growth as well. Because if you are not able to absorb large segments of the labor force, large segments of the country into these more productive parts of the economy, that is necessarily going to act as a brake on overall economic growth. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why we have the current paradox in the advanced countries, that if we look at the amount of innovation and technological change that is happening, it's enormous, right? We live in a world of enormous innovation and technological change. Yet, when you look at the statistics of overall productivity growth, total factor productivity growth, or economy-wide labor productivity, in fact, they're much lower than they were a few decades ago. So those have plateaued productivity. One reason for this is that the gap between the most productive parts of the economy and the less productive parts is now much wider. The productivity benefits of innovation is not being disseminated and distributed throughout the rest of the economy. And that fact explains not just inequality, is also one of the reasons where overall aggregate productivity is being lowered or is not rising as rapidly, right? So dissemination of productive employment and productive opportunities throughout the rest of the economy is not simply an imperative for inclusion and equity, it's also for overall productivity and overall economic growth. The third I would mention, and I was signaling this, the third consequence, an adverse consequence of this productive dualism and why we care about it and why we need to think about institutional alternatives is that I think this productive dualism also has very negative political consequences. Okay? So we know that in the last decade we've seen a rise in right-wing authoritarian populism. Right-wing authoritarian populism is has been undermining some of the sort of key tenets of pluralist democracy. This has been happening in Western Europe. Trump here was was clearly an example of that. It's also happening in a number of middle-income countries as well. We have evidence, particularly from Western Europe and the United States, that these labor market and regional divides are at least partly responsible for the rise of right-wing authoritarian populism. For example, a number of studies in the United States have shown that parts of the country which suffered the most job losses after NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement in the 1990s, or suffered the greatest amount of job loss in response to Chinese competition after China entered the WTO in the 2000s. Those were the regions where you saw the biggest vote swings from Democratic Party to right-wing Republicans, in particular in the 2016 election to President Trump. There's even one study that shows that had the China shock in terms of employment, adverse employment consequences, had been only half as strong as it had been, then 4 key states would have gone for Hillary Clinton rather than Donald Trump, with reversing the conclusion of the 2016 election. There are similar studies in Europe that also show the consequences of not just globalization shocks, but also the consequences of austerity shocks, the policies of austerity that were followed after the global financial crisis, and the adverse labor employment consequences in particular parts of the country seem to be responsible for some of these electoral consequences. Okay. So when we discuss right-wing populism, there is a long debate in the literature and in contemporary discussions about whether it's really economics or whether it's really about culture. In the US, whether it's really about race or whether it's really about sort of these areas that were adversely affected economically. We don't need to get into sort of that debate. It's clear that these issues are very intertwined. But what is clear to me is that parties of the right have been much quicker and much better in capitalizing on some of the adverse economic consequences of the kinds of trends that we're talking about, in particular the deepening of the productive dualism, and the fact that many parts of the labor market and the many parts of the country have been disadvantaged, have been left behind by these trends in economics. Okay, so I would say that's the third reason why we care about this productive dualism, besides inequality, overall productivity, and the third reason is, I think, we care about because it makes for bad politics. And I think what is happening and what is changing, and some of the policy debates I mentioned in my first set of remarks indicate that there is now a discussion on the sort of center, on the left of center or the progressive wing of each of these societies about what to do as well. But it seems to me that the right wing and the authoritarian populists were much quicker at responding to these shocks than the left of center was. So, our discussion here is going to be, how do we respond to that? How do we respond to this productive dualism, and how are we going to, what kind of institutions do we need to think about that? Here is, again, another area where I think Roberto and I agree a lot, and Roberto has already signaled where we will take the discussion towards. And we agree, I guess, because I've been brainwashed. I've been teaching with him for so long. The traditional way that we discuss how to address these problems of regions that are left behind, or labor market polarizations or inequality, is by using the traditional instruments of the welfare state. That is what Roberto called sort of, compensatory policies of redistribution. We tax the beneficiaries and redistribute to some of the losers through family grants, credits for children, for and sort of social insurance programs for people who lose their jobs. Those are the classic instruments of the welfare state. So that's how sort of welfare state and sort of social democracy took the edge of classical liberalism by introducing these mechanisms of redistribution and social insurance. The other thing that social democracy traditionally has done very well, and the welfare state has done very well, particularly in Europe, but less so in the United States, is invest in education. Invest in education so that people have the tools with which they can prosper in the labor market. They can go and find productive employment. So the classic, so the traditional remedy, or at least the one that sort of our welfare state arrangements promise us as effective remedies, are these programs of redistribution and social insurance on the one hand, programs of investment in education on the other, and training. And these programs still very much capture our imagination, partly in the United States, where the country is very far from having implemented many of these instruments in a satisfactory manner. So think about our ongoing debates about education, think about the debates on the child tax credit. These are debates that were all debates in Europe and already have been won by the proponents of the welfare state. Our view is that if the core of the problem is this productive dualism, that neither investments in education in its conventional form, nor redistributive compensatory redistribution and social insurance can adequately target the problem, can adequately deal with the problem. So we need different type of remedies, different types of institutional arrangements. Why do the conventional remedies don't work? For some countries, although not in the United States, it's really a question about sort of, how much more you can redistribute, how much more you can tax. This might be an issue in Northwest Europe, in some of the countries, not necessarily in the United States. But more fundamentally, the question is, what are we going to do to ensure that people have access to these productive opportunities, and not simply the question of how we're actually compensating them after the fact. We're not dealing necessarily with just the source of the problem. It would be much better if we're able to actually enable people to access productive employment opportunities, have access to good jobs, rather than simply give them handouts. Furthermore, with respect to education, it's not necessarily going to work to invest in education if local labor markets, local businesses are not creating an adequate number of good jobs which can employ these people. So the constraint might be often not simply that people don't have the skills, but that we don't actually have the good firms to create the jobs, to hire people. So thinking about it in this way actually opens up for me a range of different kinds of discussions that we need to have that not necessarily says we shouldn't think about the role of the welfare state, because I really believe that, especially in the United States, there's a lot more that can be done in that direction. But that there's a range of much more fundamental remedies that we need to consider that are much more directly targeting how the productive sphere of the economy operates, how labor markets operate, rather than simply redistribution after the fact or simply investing in education. So we'll talk a lot more about these, but just to give you a sense of what I have in mind, just a couple of things. One is, for example, to combine programs in education and training with programs that are much more directly focusing on the creation of employment opportunities, that is creation of firms, that is working with firms to enable greater investment in capacity, investment in employment by firms. So that's to ensure that in order to have good jobs, you need workers with good training, but you also need good firms. And good firms are not necessarily going to appear on their own in environments where there might be a whole range of obstacles. Some of them might be imposed by local governments. Some of them might be technological or have to do with the way that the markets operate. But there's a lot that public policies can do to increase the investment and the creation of firms in these areas where there is a shortage of good job opportunities. So that means complementing what one does with respect to training and education with what one is doing in the area that traditionally has been called industrial policy, although it's not necessarily focusing only on manufacturing or industries, could focus on services as well. But the idea is that you work with local firms and potential investors to provide a range of public inputs and public services that are going to be often customized to the needs of these investors to ensure that those jobs are being created. And then there's a whole question about what's the nature of the conditionality, how do you ensure that these firms that are going to be investing are also creating good jobs. Okay? So that takes you in a very different direction than how we usually think about local development policy, away from pure tax giveaways or cash incentives or tax holidays, and is much more hands-on kind of policy. A second area which I think is very important is how you think about the process of innovation and technological change in the first place. So much of our current discussion about innovation and its implications for labor markets takes the following form. Technology is changing fast. The skills that are required in the labor markets are developing very rapidly. We need to equip our local labor force, our workers, for the skills of the tomorrow. So therefore, we need to invest in their skills so they can get jobs in the businesses of tomorrow in line with the needs of technology. Okay? Something that's very odd about this framing of the issue is that it takes the direction of technological change as to what kind of workers that the businesses of the future will require as essentially completely exogenous, that's just given. In other words, society and our workers have to adjust to the needs of technology, and technology is just some rigid thing that happens on its own, completely independent from the skills or resources of our existing workforce. So in other words, it takes as given that the nature of technological change in the last few decades have been directly biased against low-educated workers, has been directly skill and capital intensive, and that the institutions that we have for directing technological change or for addressing innovation have nothing to do with the fact that technology has taken a particular direction to actually hurt relatively less educated workers. In fact, we know that there's a whole range of institutions and policies that directly impact the direction that technology changes. I mean, just the simplest way is that all our existing tax policies incentivize investment in automation because there's all kinds of these subsidies on capital investment, whereas sort of hiring workers, you pay taxes. So labor is taxed, capital is subsidized. So if this is the set of relative prices that you face in an economy, in what direction will the private sector innovate? it'll innovate in a direction that is capital intensive and will be labor saving, particularly because labor is expensive, while capital is being made cheap through a variety of public policies. That's just one example. That's sort of the set of incentives that are embedded in our current tax policies in terms of how it changes. There's a whole set of sort of implicit preferences built in the way that different parts of the federal government works, or different types of innovations are stimulated. The initial stimulus for driverless vehicles in the United States came because the Department of Defense was interested in fighting wars in areas without employing any workers, without employing any military people, so that they wouldn't get sort of killed or wounded. So the whole impetus for driverless vehicles comes from a kind of a military push that has its own logic, but does not consider what does that do in terms of the possibility for us to generate employment. I'm not saying being a driver necessarily is the best job in the world. This is just an example of how sort of different sets of, that the federal government, through its innovation policies, has been able to influence the direction in which technological change has moved. So today there is a whole variety of different ways in which customizing products, using mini robots, using robots that are, for example, or AI tools that work with people rather than replace them. There's a whole margins of technological choice in the direction in which innovation can move, some of which are more friendly to workers, some of them are less friendly to workers. These are choices that need to be made. In the Europe today, the whole talk is about sort of the green and the digital transition, how to promote green and digital transformation. None of it encompasses directly the idea of what will the innovation mean for ordinary workers, and what will be the consequences for workers of different types of skills. So going back to this sort of the established narrative that workers, the society has to fully adjust to the direction of technological change, I think we need to question that narrative and say, how can we actually think about the direction of technological change that might also make it a little bit more friendly to society, make it more friendly to our existing workforce? And that means asking some hard questions about what are the instruments we have for directing technological change and innovation, and the adaptation of technology innovation and the organization of firms and production processes at the local as well. So this is influencing directly the nature of innovation and technological change and its use in a way that's much more directly tied with our social goals of inclusion and creating good jobs, in pretty much the same way as we think about how we need to finance green technology. That's a big change, right? So in some ways, the two biggest challenges that our market economies face today is, one is the climate change. That's a major, major externality that the market doesn't take care of. And the second is the shortage of good jobs. That's the other big externality that a market economy doesn't adequately address, that it's not creating adequate number of productive middle-class good jobs, right? So we need to think about how technology can address both of those things. And while we made the mental jump in terms of thinking of green technology, we haven't made a similar jump to thinking about innovation in the service of good jobs at the same time. So we hopefully will open up that discussion in the way that we discussed.
There's one more theme I wanted to bring up in this first class, and that's the methodological theme, the background theme of this course. The two substantive themes that I addressed, the alternative institutional forms of the market order and the alternative futures of the market economy, are connected because they both require us to do something which we don't know how to do. What they require us to do is to think about structure. To think about structure, about structural change, structural discontinuity, and structural alternatives. And my claim is that we don't know how to do that. So, in classical European social theory, there was a view of structure. For example, in Marx, in Marxism, the idea that there are systems. They're what Karl Marx called the modes of production: the slave economy, feudalism, capitalism, and socialism. There's a closed list of regimes, of basic structural options in history, and they recur in the course of human history. Each of them is an indivisible system. So it either changes all at once or it doesn't change at all, in which case we have to manage it through some form of reformism. And third, there are laws that govern the foreordained succession of these systems in history. Now, the problem is very simple. This is the classical apparatus of thinking about structure, and it has become unbelievable. No one believes in it. So we still use the vocabulary that comes from this theoretical tradition, but we don't believe in the premises of the vocabulary. Now, what then about the contemporary social sciences? Economics is the most influential, best organized, most authoritative of these social sciences. Economics does not have a way of thinking about structure, because you can compare different kinds of economics. There's a pure economics, the economics developed by the marginalist theoreticians at the end of the 19th century. It makes no institutional assumptions. It has no institutional commitments. As Danny said, in the 1920s, it was demonstrated that its apparatus could be applied to so-called socialist economies. On the other hand, there is fundamentalist economics, as exemplified by, say, the School of Hayek, which affirms that the market order has a precise institutional and legal form. There is a single natural and necessary institutional form of the market economy, which is another way of suppressing the debate about structural alternatives. And so it happens in each social science, in one after the other. None of them addresses the problem of structure, of structural discontinuity, structural alternatives, structural possibilities. They don't teach us how to think about structure. We do have a way of thinking about structure, which we inherited from classical European social theory, but we can't believe in it. It has become unusable. And the alternative and the contemporary social sciences don't offer an alternative to it. That's the simple solution to the problem. So what are we going to do? We have to improvise. It's part of our agenda here. And little by little, we have to bring together elements of the way of thinking about structure that we miss and need. So let me give you an example of a theme in this way of thinking about structure. In classical European social theory, as in Marxism, there's the idea that the structure is indivisible, the regime, as the mode of production. The practical consequence is a binary idea of politics. Either you have the revolutionary substitution of one regime, of one mode of production by another, or you have the reformist management of a mode of production. So politics is either revolutionary or reformist. But it seems that that's not how real structural change happens in history. Real structural change, it seems, is always piecemeal, fragmentary, and can nevertheless become cumulative in a certain direction and even lead to radical results if it persists in that direction. But in its inception, in its way of operation, it is always fragmentary. So then we have an idea that a structure is not a system, is not an indivisible system. That's just not how it's like. That's not the way to think about it. Its different parts reinforce one another, but they don't compose an indivisible system. Now let me illustrate the practical consequences of this claim that I'm making, that we don't know how to think about structure. And I will illustrate it simply by the example of what it's like today, anywhere in the world, to propose programmatic alternatives, that is, structural alternatives. I propose to you something that's distant from what exists. And you say, that's very interesting, but it's utopian. I propose something that's close to what exists, and you say that's certainly feasible, but it's trivial. And so it happens that in the current climate of opinion, almost anything that can be proposed is likely to be dismissed as either trivial or utopian. Now, this false dilemma, because I think it is false, arises from a misunderstanding about the nature of programmatic argument. It supposes that programmatic arguments are about blueprints, when in fact they're about successions, about sequences. It's not like architecture, it's like music. But the false dilemma is aggravated by a contingent feature of the history of ideas, which is that we have no way of thinking about structure and about how structure changes. And then we fall back on this false, on this bastardized, on this vulgar conception of realism, of political realism, that something is realistic to the extent that it approaches what already exists. Then it's realistic. And that, of course, is not a coherent idea of political realism. It's simply a declaration of intellectual bankruptcy, that we don't know how to speak about structure. That's the situation. Now, why is this situation important to us in our contemporary situation and in explorations like the one that we undertake in this course? It's important to us because, like the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we have come to understand the importance, the primacy of structural alternatives. For example, on this question of the unequalizing effects of the insular knowledge economy. Compensatory and retrospective redistribution is not good enough. Because the redistribution that's necessary to deal with the chasm between the vanguard and the rearguard would have to be massive. And long before it reached the requisite dimension, it would begin to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. It would begin to exact an unacceptable cost in foregone economic output. We need to anchor the redistributive impulse in the structural organization of the economy. So we've come to recognize the primacy, the authority, the necessity of structural alternatives. But unlike the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we can no longer believe in these dogmatic structural blueprints. And therefore, we confront a problem that has no historical precedent in the history of ideas, which is how we can come to affirm the primacy of structural alternatives without succumbing to a structural dogmatism. And that's then what brings us to our discussion here in the course.
I thought you were going to criticize economics more.
No, because I briefly said there's a pure economics, which says, don't blame me, I make no institutional commitments. And there's a fundamentalist economics, which is a way of denying the problem frontally. But I don't blame economics. Economics can be blamed only because of all these social sciences. It's the most authoritative. It's the best organized. It has the most influence, and for reason. All the social sciences are in the same problem. All of them evade the imperative of structural vision. So I'm not blaming anyone. I'm blaming ourselves. I'm saying this is the reality of the situation. It's not economics that's responsible for the problem, but we have a problem.
But when you say we don't have a theory, we don't know how to talk about structure, we don't have really a theory of structural change, I want to understand what you mean. You have a theory of, you have a theory of how to talk about structure and what the structural change is, right? So at least one of us has one theory.
I'm trying, but I'm making a collective claim about the intellectual situation that we're in. And I'm saying the established disciplines on every side, the tradition of classical social theory, the contemporary social sciences, give us no direction in this task of thinking about structure. Now, there are many fragments of the kind of view that we need, and I gave an example of a fragmentary element, which is we can't accept the thesis of the indivisibility of the structures. They are divisible, and when they change piece by piece and cumulatively. So what today in the contemporary situation is the rhetorical function of the idea of the revolutionary substitution of one system by another? It has become an alibi for its opposite. So the disillusioned Marxist would say real change would be the substitution of capitalism by socialism. But this real change is not in the cards. And if it were in the cards, if it were feasible, it would be too dangerous. So what's left to do in the world is to humanize. And thus the agenda, the political agenda of the progressives, becomes the humanization of the inevitable. That's their agenda. What's their project? Their project is the project of their conservative adversaries with a human face. It's the softening of the project of their conservative adversaries. That's the direct consequence of this confusion about structure. So
maybe we should share with the class what I think is the antecedent to some of the questions, some of the comments that you've made.
Yes.
And the antecedent is our last 10 years of discussion, at least in part, where you would you would discuss one of those sort of directions of the alternative. And then I would criticize it as really being completely unrealistic. Or somebody in the class more likely would raise their hand and say that
yes.
this is pie in the sky. Or actually my specific criticism would be that the different elements of the system you were discussing were so complementary with each other that it was difficult to imagine how you could make the leap from our current equilibrium to the system you were describing. And then you would come back and say, well, that's a mistake to think that that we can't actually move to that alternative system, that we need to do one great leap into that we could actually move it from our existing arrangements, and there are sort of step-by-step ways, and there's no contradiction between thinking
yes.
about these alternatives. but also being practical in that you have to work, you start from where you are, but it's really what matters is this cumulative system, and what you need to keep your mind, you need to have a clear idea of what the target is, but that doesn't mean that you don't start with what, so is that,
So-
it may be useful to
So you have to have an idea of the direction, and you have to be able to select in a particular circumstance the first steps by which to begin to move in that direction. So this combination of a provisional, revisable view of the direction with the circumstantial selection of the first steps is the beginning. And it necessarily commits you to an idea of structural change as being by its nature fragmentary. So that is an example of a beginning of how one could begin to lift one's way up.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, yeah, maybe I think some of this might be a lot clearer when we discuss it in specific institutional domains,
course.
where we get concrete in the
of
rest.
course.
But we should give the class a chance to make some points, raise some questions. The last 10 minutes. Yes.
Sorry, I don't have the mic card yet. Thank you very much. It's been really interesting. I just want to go back to a point that you raised about education. You said that education isn't working in the same way as it used to. And you mentioned specifically local markets. But while local markets might not have those jobs, in an international economy, an educated workforce might be a pull factor for bringing in new jobs. And that's surely only more true in, as you were saying, when industrialized jobs are increasingly skill intensive. And it also opens up the knowledge economy. So in the Philippines, which has become a major outsourcing center due to a high level of English fluency. Ireland, which had, I think in 1989, one engineering job for 488 graduate engineers, but is now a major technological center. So I was just curious on what your thought was on why education isn't making the same impact it used to, when this increasingly globalized world would seem like it would open up a lot more opportunities.
So I think what is happening is that that on existing trends, what has been happening is that the skill and education content of the jobs that are being created is moving much faster than our ability to instill those skills in our current workforce. So if there was a magic wand where we can basically turn, you mentioned the Philippines. If we're able to sort of have the entire Philippine labor force be college educated and with the requisite skills and education to be employed in those business processing, internationally marketable service sectors, then there would be no problem at all for the Philippines. There wouldn't be this problem of structural dualism that we're talking about. Yet even in the Philippines, which is a relatively successful case of having been able to access those internationally tradable services, it's a very narrow segment of the labor force that is able to access that. So there's a very big gap between the skills that are not only that are currently embodied, or the education level that's embodied in the labor force, but as a practical matter, our ability to expand that sufficiently rapidly, because you have to keep in mind that the skill requirements of those vanguard jobs isn't staying constant either. So in fact, the problem is that the gap has been increasing. So in that kind of a situation, then the remedy becomes either we need to double up our efforts on education, which is the standard remedy. But I'm saying, yes, of course, let's do the best that we can on education and training. But at least, some part of the responsibility has to be also in the way that, we're the kind of technologies and skill requirements we're embedding in our technologies as well. So in a world where, that it was easier to rise through a kind of a middle-class job because the skill or education requirements of middle-class jobs was much less limited, it was easier to make that transformation than in a kind of world where this dichotomy is much starker.
The implicit premise of this claim of yours is that there's a contrast to be made between an evolution of technology that replaces labor and an evolution of technology that enhances labor. And that's within our power to guide. So it's back to your theme, the technology is not just a given, an exogenous constraint. It's part of the structural reality in which we would intervene.
So we're facing, sort of, the world of high tech just, faces this, wide range of choices with respect to what kind of AI you're going to be investing in. Whether you're the kind of AI you invest in makes your worker much more directly monitorable, measurable, and controllable, or the kind of AI you'll invest in where they can have, digital tools that are enhancing what they can do and make them more productive, but, work with them rather than, either replace them or make them more controllable, turning these jobs into very precarious, undesirable jobs. So that's the issue for the vanguard sector. Yeah.
And there's a question of what you think ultimately the ideal relation of the worker and the machine is.
Yes.
Because in Adam Smith's pin factory or in Henry Ford's assembly line, the worker worked as if he were one of his machines through repetitious movements that mimicked the formulaic movements of the rigid machine. And what you could say is that in principle, we have a much higher ideal. What is a machine for? Everything that we've learned how to repeat, we can express in a formula or an algorithm, and then we embody the formula or an algorithm in the physical contraption, the machine. The machine is to do for us what we've learned how to repeat, so that we can reserve our supreme resource, our time, for the not yet repeatable. And then the idea is that the combination of the machine with the anti-machine is the worker, is immensely more powerful than either of them alone. But that's not an ideal which would arise spontaneously in history. That's the result of a campaign. That's a conception of what we would want, and something for which we would have to fight.
Yes.
When you were talking about
Can people in the back hear, by the way, when people are in the front? If you can't hear in the back, just let us know so we'll speak more loudly.
so when you were describing the consequences of this production dualism, one of the items was, of course, it was the political divide. There were many consequences, but one of the items was related to kind of spatial or geographical distribution. But on the consequence, on the solutions, I think you kind of left this behind or to the side. So you didn't mention, of course, you mentioned the relationship between investing in education with training, creation of new firms, and then you have the second point on the connection between how we understand the relationship between technology and society, which should serve which, but then is it worth thinking about a geographical or spatial solution to this as well?
No, thank you. In fact, I mentioned two directions broadly. The first one was meant explicitly to be much more local, quite exactly in the direction that, because I think much of the job, so the second one was the general point about the direction of technological change, and that's not a local issue because you have to address national, federal policies or global policies, and that's sort of, you have to address where technology is being generated. There's a question of how technology is being adopted, which might be much more local, but that's the second issue, is much more sort of general. But the first set of issues with respect to pairing training with sort of firm-based policies, much more sort of industrial policy type thing, that I meant to be actually largely local, because that is a set of activities that is going to be, for all practical purposes, will be done at the local level, even if the impetus comes from a national campaign or a national policy, is going to be done at a very local level where you have local development agencies working with local firms, potential investors, community colleges in the US, local NGOs, trying to create that enabling environment for these kinds of good jobs being created locally. And that's where, in fact, we connect with another point that was made under the sort of this question about structure and how we get to change there. If we recognize that there's already a set of these local experiments that is taking place, and they are taking place because we know that some of these things are happening more successfully in some places than in others. That's the kernel which allows us to move, on which we can build to make the step that's going to be more cumulative and is going to take us in a particular direction. That's where I would see the connection between sort of the existing local practice and this ultimately the structural alternative. But we need to start working on what exists. One of the, I mean, when you think about some of the most important policy experiments in the world in the last 30 years probably have come at the level of sort of municipalities. And I've always said that that's the reason, because there's never been a Washington consensus for municipal policy. And so when you're a local leader, you have to experiment because there's not a guidebook, there's not a blueprint. So there's been a huge amount of experimentation at the local level. When local politicians have to deal, policymakers have to deal with the challenges that they face locally, and of course, absence of local jobs, absence of investment is the problems that they have to address. So they're doing things without appeal to any kind of received theory or received blueprint or anything that we discuss in economics classes, in colleges, and that has been actually very interesting, because they have generated solutions out of this local practice. And now it's, in fact, it's our turn now to learn from what that local practice actually has learned. And so that's something that I'm particularly interested in, is learning and building on that local practice. But it is local, as you rightly emphasize.
I have a question perhaps for our collective curiosity. So it seems that we moved from the diagnostic to the prescriptive, and then from the empirical problems that we are in to the more structural problems that towards the end Zona raised. My question is on the word that didn't quite appear what I was expecting to appear, which is the normative. So it seems there is a deep normative commitment, or a commitment to ask normative questions when it comes to what visions are animating our search for these structural problems to the empirical dilemma that we are living in. And well, of course, both Smith and Marx were animated by deep humanistic concerns that then translated into their empirical research on economics, and that was happening around him. My question is, on the one, of course, I think these big questions would occur during the discussions with the undergraduates who have less work experience, more big questions to raise. But I wonder, in our discussions, what is the role of the normative, and what are the roles of the ways normative visions are animating the discussions we'll be having together on these big structural problems that we face today?
So I think there's